Touch me again, and you'll regret it.
Touch me again, and you'll regret it. The warning did not waver. Rachel's voice, low and laced with a quiet, lethal promise, sliced clean through the clinking of crystal and the low murmurs of downtown Houston's elite. She stood dead center in the grand dining room of Le Petit Chateau's, her finger pointed directly at the chest of the city's most feared man. Fosco Palerma did not blink. Under the amber glow of the massive gold chandeliers, his olive skin looked almost bronze, the sharp lines of his jaw dusted with dark stubble. Intricate black ink crawled up his throat and mapped his hands, disappearing into the cuffs of a tailored black dress shirt. On his wrist, a luxury silver watch caught the light. His 3 heavy-set bodyguards in matching black suits immediately shifted, hands reaching beneath their jackets, but Fosco raised a single hand to stop them. His dark, predatory eyes locked onto Rachel. She refused to back down. With her glowing black skin, dark curly hair piled high in a messy bun, and her white button-up shirt fitted to her striking, curvaceous frame, she was a force of nature. Her black satin apron was tied tightly at her waist, a stark, working-class contrast to the opulence around her. But right now, she was the most dangerous thing in the room. Before we get into it, if stories like this one get you right in the heart, hit that like button and subscribe now so you don't miss what happens between them. By the time the midnight rush at Le Petit Chateau's finally thinned, the adrenaline that had carried Rachel through her confrontation with Fosco Palerma began to sour into a cold, heavy dread. She retreated to the staff break room, her fingers trembling slightly as she unpinned her messy bun and let her dark curls spill over her shoulders. She pulled a crumpled, official-looking letter from her handbag. The bold red stamp across the top read notice of foreclosure. The predatory lenders at Texas Southern Trust didn't care about heritage, and they certainly didn't care about her late father's legacy. They only saw 300 acres of prime, sun-bleached hill country just outside Austin, and they wanted it back. To the wealthy oil tycoons and city elite she served every night, Rachel was just a striking, quiet presence in a satin apron, invisible except when she was bringing them their rare ribeyes. They had no idea she spent her 40-minute commute back to the county line crying from sheer exhaustion, her hands permanently smelling of lemon-scented table sanitizer and the dry, iron-rich dust of the ranch. Her father had worked himself into an early grave to keep those pastures green, and she was currently working 16-hour double shifts just to keep the bank from locking the rusted iron gates for good. Driving home in her battered pickup truck, the neon skyline of Houston faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the vast, sprawling dark of the Texas countryside. The air through her cracked window changed, turning thick and warm, carrying the sweet scent of wild sage and dry earth. The ranch was her sanctuary, the only place where she felt she could breathe without a mask, but the weight of the soil was crushing her. She was fighting a losing war against a bank that had unlimited resources, armed with nothing but a waitress's tips and an unyielding, defensive pride that refused to let her ask for help. As she pulled up the gravel driveway and stared at the dark silhouette of the family home, Rachel clutched the steering wheel until her knuckles turned ash gray. She would burn the land to ash herself before she let some city suit take it from her. Fosco Palerma did not tolerate disrespect. In his world, a pointed finger was usually answered with a bullet, and yet, hours after the scene at Le Petit Chateau's, the memory of the beautiful, curvaceous waitress with the blazing eyes still gripped him. Sitting in the leather-bound luxury of his high-rise office overlooking the glowing Houston skyline, Fosco swirled a glass of amber bourbon, his silver watch catching the dim light. Across from him, his chief enforcer waited in tense silence, expecting the order for her elimination. Instead, Fosco merely gestured to the sleek tablet on his desk. "Tell me about her," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The dossier his men compiled within hours revealed a story that made Fosco's dark eyes narrow with sudden intrigue. Her name was Rachel. She was a woman working grueling double shifts to stay afloat, but it was her home that truly caught his attention. Rachel was the sole heir to a 300-acre ranch sprawling across the rugged, isolated hills outside Austin. It was a historic piece of land, deeply loved and desperately guarded, but it was currently drowning in debt. The predatory bankers at Texas Southern Trust had already initiated foreclosure proceedings, and Rachel was fighting them entirely alone, weaponizing her pride against a system designed to crush her. Fosco leaned back, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. He had expected to find a foolish girl playing at bravery, but instead, he had found a warrior fiercely protecting her territory. He traced the dark ink climbing up his collar, his mind instantly mapping the strategic value of her property. It was isolated, bordered by endless state parks, and virtually invisible to the prying eyes of the rival cartels currently pushing into his territory. It was the perfect tactical outpost. But more than the strategic advantage of the land, it was Rachel herself that fascinated him. She was raw, fierce, and entirely unbroken by the weight of the world. Fosco closed the screen. He didn't want her dead. He wanted to see just how far that unyielding spirit would go to protect what was hers. The dust had barely settled on the gravel driveway when the low, rhythmic thrum of heavy engines broke the quiet of the Texas twilight. Rachel stepped out onto the porch of the ranch house, her hand instinctively resting on the weathered wooden railing. A fleet of 3 sleek, black SUVs rolled to a stop, their tinted windows catching the last orange rays of the setting sun. From the middle vehicle, the door opened, and Fosco Palerma stepped out into the dry country air. He looked entirely out of place in his tailored black dress shirt and gleaming luxury watch against the backdrop of peeling paint and wild sage. Yet he carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who owned everything his shadow touched. Rachel stood her ground, her jaw set, her dark eyes narrowing as Fosco approached the porch alone, leaving his suited enforcers by the idling vehicles. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice a low, warning chime. Fosco stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps, looking up at her with a calm, maddeningly patient expression. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, official-looking manila envelope, tossing it lightly onto the small table beside her rocking chair. "Texas Southern Trust doesn't own your family's land anymore, Rachel," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that vibrated in the quiet evening. Rachel stared at the envelope, her heart hammering against her ribs. She snatched it up, ripping it open to find her outstanding mortgage documents, stamped in bold, blue ink, paid in full. "What did you do?" she whispered, her pride warring with a sudden, suffocating panic. "I bought your debt," Fosco replied simply, stepping up the first stair. The dark tattoos on his neck shifted as he tilted his head, locking his dark, intense gaze onto hers. "Every cent of it. The bank is out of the picture. You don't owe some faceless corporation in Houston anymore." He took another step, closing the distance between them until she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of the coming rain. "You answer to me now." By the next morning, the quiet solitude of the ranch was entirely replaced by the clinical, quiet efficiency of Fosco's operation. Blacked-out SUVs sat parked beneath the shade of the ancient live oaks, and silent, broad-shouldered men in dark suits patrolled the perimeter of the property, their eyes constantly scanning the brush. They moved into the old wooden barn, setting up encrypted communications and heavy, steel-plated tactical cases while Rachel watched from the kitchen window, her hands gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles ached. The ranch had been her father's sanctuary, a place of peace, and now it was a fortress for a man who traded in violence. Coexisting with Fosco was a daily, silent war. Rachel refused to cower in her own home. She carried herself with an unyielding, quiet defiance, moving through the house as if the armed men in her living room were nothing more than unwanted dust. When Fosco's men tried to dictate her movements or warn her away from certain rooms, Rachel simply stepped right past them, her dark eyes flashing with a pride that made even the hardened enforcers step back. She cooked, she cleaned, and she ran her ranch, refusing to let them shrink her presence. Fosco watched her constantly. From the head of her dining table, where he sat mapping out shipping routes on a digital tablet, his dark eyes would follow her every movement. He watched the proud, fluid grace of her walk, the sharp, defensive tilt of her chin, and the way her white button-up shirt clung to her striking curves. He did not speak much, but his silence was a heavy, intoxicating pressure in the room. Every time their paths crossed in the narrow hallways, Rachel refused to yield the right of way. She would stand her ground, forcing Fosco to either brush past her or step aside. More than once, he chose to step close, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of her lavender soap, his gaze dropping to her lips before he let her pass with a slow, knowing smile. It was a battle of wills with no words spoken, a dangerous friction that grew more intense with every passing day. A low roll of distant Texas thunder shook the kitchen window panes, a welcome break from the oppressive heat of the day. Rachel stood by the sink, pouring a glass of cold water, her dark curls damp against the back of her neck. She thought she was alone until a match flared in the darkness of the screen porch, briefly illuminating the sharp, striking angles of Fosco's face. He sat in the shadows, his tailored black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dense, dark tattoos mapping his forearms. He did not look like an untouchable kingpin tonight. He looked human and incredibly tired. "You should be asleep," Fosco said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried over the heavy rhythm of the cicadas. "It's my house," Rachel replied, stepping out onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the weathered wood. "I sleep when I want." She leaned against the railing, keeping her distance, but her eyes locked onto his. "And you should be plotting your next takeover." Fosco let out a soft, humorless chuckle, exhaling a thin stream of smoke into the warm night air. "Everyone wants the crown, Rachel, until they feel how heavy the damn thing is. You spend your entire life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the one hand you trust to hold the knife." He looked up, his dark eyes arresting in the dim light. "At least out here, the threats are simple. The wild doesn't pretend to be your friend." "Don't look for sympathy from me," Rachel said, her voice dropping, thick with defensive pride. "You think your burden is heavy? My father bled into this dirt. I've worked myself to the bone to keep it from being stolen by men who wear suits just like yours. My pride is all I have left, and I won't let you, or anyone else, make me feel small in my own home." Fosco stood up slowly, stubbing out his cigarette. He stepped into her space, his towering frame casting a shadow over her, yet his movements were entirely devoid of threat. The scent of rain, tobacco, and expensive cologne enveloped her. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the sharp line of her jaw, his touch sending a sudden, electric heat straight to her core. "I don't want to make you small, Rachel," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips, his voice thick with a sudden, dangerous hunger. "Your pride is the most beautiful thing about you." The humid Texas night clung to the ranch like a second skin, heavy and expectant with the scent of ozone from the stalled storm. Down in the shadows of the old wooden barn, far from the house where Rachel and Fosco had shared their quiet, charged truce, a phone screen flared. The blue light cut across the scarred face of Mateo, Fosco's most trusted lieutenant, a man who had stood by the underboss since their early days in the Houston streets. Mateo didn't look like a traitor, but the hunger for his own crown had finally eroded his decades of loyalty. He pressed the phone to his ear, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper that was swallowed by the creak of the barn's timbers. "He's here," Mateo muttered into the receiver, his eyes scanning the dark perimeter to ensure none of the other sentries were within earshot. "The ranch is out in the sticks, completely isolated. Perfect blind spot. If you hit it tonight, you'll catch him with his guard down." On the other end of the line, the raspy, dry chuckle of Alejandro, the ruthless head of the rival Jalisco cartel, echoed through the static. The cartels had been trying to dismantle the Palerma syndicate's hold on the southern shipping routes for years. A hidden, rural outpost was a vulnerability they could not pass up. "And the girl?" Alejandro asked. "The one who owns the dirt." "Collateral damage," Mateo dismissed coldly, his fingers tightening around the cold steel of his concealed sidearm. "Just bring enough heat to make sure he doesn't walk away. Once Palerma is dead, the Houston territory is ours to split. I'll disable the security feeds on the western fence line by midnight." Disconnecting the call, Mateo slid the phone back into his pocket, his face hardening as he looked up toward the warm yellow light glowing from the ranch house kitchen window. He had served Fosco for 10 years, watched him grow more powerful, and now watched him grow soft over a defiant waitress with a stubborn streak. To Mateo, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a necessary correction. As he stepped out of the barn and back into the dark, humid night, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, washing away his footsteps and setting the countdown to a slaughter in motion. The storm finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that lashed against the wooden siding of the ranch house. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire property into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The low hum of the tactical monitors in the barn died instantly. Inside the house, Rachel froze in the hallway, the sudden pitch blackness making her pulse skyrocket. Before she could even call out, a heavy, warm hand clamped gently over her mouth, and she was pulled back into the shadows of the living room. The scent of rain and expensive cologne told her it was Fosco. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration against her ear. The power didn't fail. It was cut. Outside, the silence of the Texas countryside was shattered by the muffled metallic cough of suppressed gunfire, followed by the heavy, wet thuds of his perimeter guards hitting the muddy earth. Mateo's sabotage of the western fence line had worked flawlessly. Black-clad figures, their faces obscured by tactical masks, moved like ghosts through the driving rain, advancing on the house from three sides. Fosco drew his sleek, black semi-automatic pistol, the silver watch on his wrist catching the faint, strobing light of the distant lightning. He pushed Rachel behind the solid oak staircase just as the front door was kicked off its hinges with a deafening splinter of wood. Heavy tactical boots trampled into the foyer. Fosco didn't hesitate. He stepped into the corridor, firing 3 rapid shots that dropped the lead assassin, but the return fire was overwhelming. Automatic rounds tore through the plaster walls, showering them in white dust and shattered glass. Fosco retreated step by step, firing with cold, practiced precision, but there were too many of them. His remaining loyal men were being cut down in the courtyard. Pinned against the back hallway with his ammunition running dangerously low, Fosco's dark eyes met Rachel's through the chaotic muzzle flashes. For the first time since she had met him, she saw a flicker of grim finality in his gaze. The monsters had finally breached the gates, and the king was cornered in her home. Rachel's fear didn't paralyze her. It transformed into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was her dirt, her father's house, and she refused to let these invaders paint her walls with blood. Slipping away from the staircase into the pitch-black pantry, she reached behind a false wooden panel she'd known since childhood. Her fingers wrapped around the cold, familiar steel of her father's bolt-action Winchester hunting rifle. She loaded 3 heavy .30-06 rounds by touch, her breathing deliberate and slow. She knew every creaking floorboard, every blind spot, and every shortcut in this house. While Fosco suppressed the attackers from the hallway, his ammunition clicked empty, the dry sound of a dead weapon echoing in the dark. A cartel assassin sneered, stepping out of the shadows with his weapon raised directly at Fosco's chest. He never pulled the trigger. From the shadows of the high kitchen loft, accessible only by a hidden back stairwell, Rachel fired. The thunderous boom of the hunting rifle shook the rafters. The heavy round struck the assassin, throwing him backward onto the floor. "Fosco! Left corridor!" Rachel yelled, her voice ringing out with absolute authority. Before the remaining 2 gunmen could locate her in the rafters, she chambered another round and fired through the drywall, hitting one in the shoulder. Fosco, seizing the distraction, lunged forward, scooped up the fallen assassin's weapon, and cleanly neutralized the other. The kitchen fell into a ringing, smoke-filled silence, broken only by the sound of the pouring Texas rain outside. Rachel scrambled down the wooden loft ladder, the heavy rifle held tight to her chest. She stood over the fallen men, her chest heaving under her white button-up shirt, her dark curls damp with sweat. Fosco stared at her, the smoking tactical pistol in his hand, his dark eyes wide with an emotion that looked dangerously like awe. He slowly stepped over the debris, his silver watch catching the dim light filtering through the shattered windows. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then up into her fierce, beautiful face. "I told you," Rachel breathed, her voice shaking but her gaze unbroken. "Nobody makes me small in my own home." The morning sun finally broke through the heavy storm clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the rain-drenched Texas dirt. The smell of gunpowder and wet earth hung thick in the air as Fosco's remaining loyal men quietly cleared the wreckage from the courtyard. Mateo's betrayal had been met with swift, lethal finality. Fosco had personally dealt with his former lieutenant in the damp shadows of the barn, leaving no loose ends. Inside the bullet-scarred kitchen, Rachel stood by the counter, her white button-up shirt smeared with plaster dust and soot. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching from the kickback of her father's Winchester, but her head remained held high. Fosco walked in, his heavy boots clicking on the floor. His slicked-back hair was damp, and a thin line of dried blood marked his cheek, but his presence was as commanding as ever. He didn't look at the ruined walls. His dark, intense eyes were fixed entirely on her. He stopped inches away, the silver luxury watch on his tattooed wrist gleaming in the morning light. Without a word, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the manila envelope containing the debt agreement. With a slow, deliberate motion, Fosco ripped the documents in half, and then in half again, letting the shredded pieces of paper flutter onto the counter. "You don't owe me a thing, Rachel," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The ranch is yours, clean, free, and completely untouched by my world." Rachel stared at the torn papers, her breath catching as a wave of relief washed over her. "And what about you?" she asked quietly, her dark eyes searching his face. "Are you packing up your circus and leaving?" Fosco took a step closer, his hands reaching out to gently grip her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. His touch sent a familiar, electric shock straight through her. "I don't want a front anymore, Rachel. And I don't want a hostage," he murmured, his dark eyes burning with an intense, raw devotion. "I want an equal. Someone who doesn't blink when the monsters show up. Run the state with me. Be my queen." Rachel looked at the man holding her, then out at her wild, beautiful land. The game had changed, and she wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was ready to rule.